Es periodista, es economista.
He is a journalist and an economist. He has witnessed major events in the 20th century and is the author of many books. His latest book, co-authored with others, is called To Understand and Change the World Today. We are here with Roberto Savio, an Italian journalist from Rome, important to specify in Italy, who also has Argentine nationality. Thank you very much for being with us. It's a pleasure. This book, To Understand and Change the World Today, was published in Italy under the title Manual for the Global Citizen. Why does someone today need a manual to navigate the world? Because people today live in a world they don't really know. Not only geographically, but also in terms of global issues. They feel overwhelmed, believing that the world marches on above them without their participation in decision-making. That's partly true, but there's also responsibility on the side of the communication system, television, social media, which leads people to stop reading and lose interest in global topics. And yet global issues aren't local. Climate change can't be solved only in Chile or Turkey. It's global. Finance is another global problem. Most major problems are now global. So this book is very straightforward. It identifies the 19 most important global problems and explains them in simple terms. I actually had a 14-year-old girl review my text. I had to rewrite it 3 times because she didn't know, for example, what the stock market was. We assume everyone knows that. So there's a generational language gap, which is very significant now, especially with artificial intelligence. I see a chapter called The Global Citizen, The New Citizen, and it begins by saying that Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, and other nationalists consider the term global negative. Yet you see it as positive? I do see global as a positive term by itself. What happened is globalization took on negative connotations, and Trump actually defends neoliberal globalization. Henry Kissinger famously said, "Globalization is just another term for U.S. hegemony." So the U.S. supports globalization as long as it serves as a hegemonic tool. If it stops serving that purpose, they lose interest. What Trump is doing is trying to restore a unipolar system led by the U.S. But the world is no longer that simple. It's multipolar, and it won't be easy to implement policies unilaterally without allies. For Trump, everyone else is the same. Germany equals Turkey. That's unrealistic.
Tenemos el temor que la tecnología someta a los hombres. Es decir, que haya una estructura piramidal, jerárquica.
Some people fear that technology will dominate humankind with a pyramidal power structure, where a few decide everything, while the rest of us become mere numbers, bombarded with information filtered by algorithms. They say we are increasingly less free, controlled by a small group that dominates society. Yes, that's the path we're on. That's why the book aims to help people understand the world they live in, so they can be active citizens, not just locally, but globally as well. They can grasp global phenomena and act accordingly.
y actuar en relación con ello. En estos fenómenos globales, la llegada de la inteligencia artificial es de lejos el fenómeno más
One of the
importante.
most significant global phenomena
Yo
is artificial
actualmente soy
intelligence.
representante
I
en
currently
Italia
represent the
de la
University
Universidad
for
para
Peace
la
of the
Paz de
United
Naciones
Nations in
Unidas,
Italy. On
desde la
October
Asamblea
28th of
General
last
del
year,
28
the
de
General
octubre del año
Assembly approved the
pasado,
opening of a chair
resolvió
in
la
Rome
Asamblea
on
en Roma
artificial intelligence.
una cátedra sobre la inteligencia artificial, que es lo que estoy poniendo en marcha, que no va a
It
ser
won't focus
sobre
on
la
the technical
inteligencia
side,
artificial como
but
este
precisely
término,
on the
sobre
social and ethical
exactamente lo que
concerns
usted
you
decía.
mentioned.
Hay más gente que ha pisado la luna que gente que tiene plataformas.
More
La
people have walked on
plataforma
the
la
moon than
tiene
own platforms.
máximo
There
dos
aren't even
pisos
10 such individuals,
y
split
se
between
divide
Americans and
entre
Chinese.
americanos y chinos. Los europeos, por ejemplo, no están en ningún
Europe, for
lado.
instance, is nowhere to be found in that
Y
sector.
estas plataformas son jaulas con paredes flexibles,
These
donde uno
platforms are
entra
like cages with flexible
y
walls.
después no sale más.
Once you go in, you don't leave
Porque esta
because they give
plataforma
you
te
everything
da
you
todo
need.
lo que necesita,
They tell you where to
te dice
shop,
dónde comprar,
what to
qué
buy,
comprar,
how to reduce power
si el frigider
consumption,
está lleno o
what
no,
book to read.
cómo reducir el consumo de la luz, qué libro leer, qué cosas hacer. Y la gente lentamente entra en este mecanismo
Gradually,
en
you
el
enter
cual
that
no
mechanism where
se
you don't have
decide
to
que
think.
piense,
You only have to
se
consume.
decide que sea un consumidor. Es el triunfo del consumismo,
It's the triumph of
donde el
consumerism,
hombre
where citizens
ciudadano
become consumers
pasa a ser
and even
consumidor
data points,
e incluso
because the
datos,
system is based on data.
porque el sistema está basado en datos, donde si a mí me gusta
If I like a
poner
blue
una
shirt,
camisa
it
azul,
connects me with others who
me
like
pone
the
en
same.
contacto con toda la gente que le
Then
gusta
when
la
I meet
camisa
someone
azul.
who wears a red
Resultado,
shirt, there's no
el día que
dialogue.
yo encuentro uno que tiene una camisa roja y no hay más diálogo, porque el diálogo se pierde, el otro es uno
They become
distinto,
the other,
diferente, del
different
cual
from
no hay
me,
respeto.
and there's no
Y la gente
respect.
se pelea.
People fight.
Y los medios sociales están creando una sociedad polarizada donde el mundo se pelea, se
Social
insulta,
media are creating a
da
polarized
espacio a
society
rabia,
full of
conspiraciones,
insults,
la cosa
conspiracy
peor de los
theories,
instintos
and the
humanos.
worst human instincts.
Y hay gente que utiliza
Some
este
people
mundo
exploit that
para
environment to
llegar
gain
al
power.
poder. Y este mecanismo es un mecanismo que nunca hubo en ninguna revolución industrial, la primera vez.
This is the
La
first
revolución
industrial
industrial que
revolution
crea
that creates
varones
barons with no borders, no
sin
religion,
fronteras,
no national
sin
identity,
religión,
a truly
sin
globalized
identidad de
virtual
país,
world.
un mundo
We need to
global,
prevent that from
donde la gente
dominating
entra
us.
en este mundo virtual y ya se queda. Esto es lo que tenemos que impedir.
Pertenecemos a una generación que seguramente es la generación que ha recibido
Our
mayores
generation
impactos
has witnessed more
tecnológicos, de
technological
avance
change than
tecnológico en la
any in
historia de
human
la
history.
humanidad.
Sin duda.
No sé, cuando éramos niños no había prácticamente teléfonos, había que conseguir el teléfono a algún vecino.
When we
Había
were
pocos
children, there were
autos,
barely
había
any
muchas carretas y
telephones or cars.
carretones,
Then came fax
en
machines,
fin, después
computers,
salieron los
email.
computadores, salió el fax, después el fax
We've seen it all.
electrónico, en fin, ha pasado de todo. Usted fue testigo de momentos cúlmines del siglo XX.
You witnessed
La
key 20th century
conferencia
moments,
afroasiática de Bandung
the
en
1955 Afro-Asian
1955, la
Conference in
reunión
Bandung,
de Tito,
Tito,
con
Nasser, and Nehru meeting in
en
Yugoslavia in
Yugoslavia en
1960
1960,
that led to the non-aligned
la
movement.
la que sentó la base de los no alineados, la primera cumbre norte-sur del
The first
78.
North-South Summit in
¿Qué queda de todo
1978.
eso?
What
¿Queda
remains of
algo
all that?
o es
Is it
como
gone?
que
Like the
queda del
fax?
o de las máquinas mecánicas, las Olivetti, que usaron los periodistas italianos tanto tiempo?
Esa es una pregunta muy compleja. Voy a intentar de contestarla por dos partes. Uno, la tecnología
It's a
siempre ha sido
complex
una
question.
revolución.
I'll try to break it
La
down.
introducción del ferrocarril, la revolución de la máquina.
First, technology has
la
always been
máquina
revolutionary.
del siglo
The steam engine,
1790,
the train, the introduction of science into industry in the late 19th century, the emergence of the internet,
Además de la máquina entra la ciencia, y entra la ciencia y se produce el proceso de modernización de la industrialización. La tercera revolución industrial cuando llega Internet y ahora estamos en la cuarta. Esta es mucho más profunda.
now we're in the fourth industrial
y más
revolution,
global. Las otras
more
tenían
profound and more global than
más
any
local
before.
de esta. De todo este periodo en que la humanidad reaccionó después del fin de la Guerra Mundial, organizándose en multilateralismo.
After World War II, humanity set up a multilateral system, the UN, the European Union, various international bodies, based on common values, peace, social justice, cooperation.
Bueno, este periodo en que se ha buscado una gobernabilidad mundial basada en valores comunes se interrumpe de manera muy violenta con la llegada de Reagan. Porque Reagan dice, yo no creo que...
That changed radically with Ronald Reagan, who said he didn't think the U.S. should be bound by the same rules as other countries in the UN General Assembly, where everyone has one vote.
De una asamblea general, ¿no es cierto? Cada país vale un voto. Y a partir de allá empezó un camino que fue...
That led to marginalizing the UN, which is now paralyzed by veto powers in the Security Council.
Por el poder de veto de los 5 países que tienen derecho de veto, que se están opuestos entre ellos y paralizan todo.
The idea of a global society founded on shared values is fading. Today, the prevailing theory is that each country should pursue its own interests. Moving from values to interests transforms society. A society based purely on interests inevitably leads to conflict, whereas with shared values, you can negotiate. I believe we are entering a chaotic era, a breakdown of multilateralism. But maybe by 2032, in 2 more electoral cycles, we'll realize we must live together, cooperate, and adopt new global structures. For now, we're in transition. Young people don't see it because they're busy in their internet bubbles. They don't ask where are we going, but it affects them the most. My generation at least has some stability, pensions, etc. But according to UN calculations, many young people might end up with pensions of $780 if they get one at all. How will they survive on that? We need to get them thinking and acting instead of just scrolling on social media.
Vamos a hacer un pequeño alto. Yo me hago una pregunta, o vamos a hacer preguntas.
Let's take a quick break. I have some questions. How does the crisis of the traditional media affect all of this? What about the crisis of capitalism, the crisis in Europe, and maybe even the crisis of the church in the Western world? We're speaking with journalist and economist Roberto Savio, author of the book To Understand and Change the World Today, together with other authors. It's like a manual for the global citizen so we can make decisions and orient ourselves. I posed questions about the crisis of the traditional media, the crisis of capitalism, including the Chinese model, Europe's potential collapse, a new Cold War, the crisis of Catholicism. What does this mean for a young person? These are excellent questions, but quite complex. Let me try to address them. First, the media crisis is also an information crisis. It has 2 elements. 1, media outlets are increasingly tools of power for their owners. Jeff Bezos buys the Washington Post, Elon Musk buys Twitter. This is more extreme than ever. This is turning the media into an instrument of power in a way never seen before. Of course, there were always figures like Hearst, who owned a chain of newspapers, and Murdoch, who has his own newspaper chain. But there is a study, for example, on how Elon Musk used Twitter during the electoral campaign. He had engineers working on it. A very detailed Harvard University study shows that when he began supporting Trump, his engineers applied a multiplier factor of 1,000 to the likes he received. So it looked like he had enormous support, but in reality it was artificial. This kind of manipulation, thanks to technological capabilities, is new. As a result, the media have lost their role as the window through which citizens view the world. Previously, one would pick up a newspaper to follow what was happening in the world. But now newspapers focus only on individual events. They no longer cover the broader processes behind them. And the world is made of processes. That level of technological manipulation is new. Artificial intelligence will increase this crisis because it offers short, pill-sized answers, like chat does. If I ask it to condense a Shakespeare play into 1,500 words, it does so perfectly. As the founder of Amazon, Bezos, once said, "It's not important to know, what matters is knowing where to look." These are two very different things. If I genuinely know something, it becomes part of me. But if I only know where to look it up, it remains external to me. As a result, we are losing humanity's capacity to be at the center of communication. And communication today is pulled between the market and the news. That, for me, is the fundamental crisis in the media, and it's only getting more pronounced.
La segunda pregunta, bueno, allá hay un tema fundamental.
Second, capitalism has always had multiple faces. There was Rhenish, German capitalism, where labor unions sat on company boards.
Entonces hubo casos famosos, como el caso de la Volkswagen, que tiene que despedir 20,000 personas.
For instance, Volkswagen once avoided firing 20,000 employees by cutting salaries 5%. That was an ethical brand of capitalism. Today, that's mostly gone. Now we have the kind of capitalism that stems from what is known as the Washington Consensus. In the 1980s, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the U.S. Treasury agreed that the market, not human beings, should be at the center of the economy. From that point on, everything changed. The Berlin Wall fell, communism ceased to be a threat, and capitalism was able to continue unchecked. We then had 20 years of unbridled capitalism until the 2008 Wall Street crisis. In 2008, people began to realize the system wasn't working, that it wasn't true globalization made everyone richer and lifted all boats. It lifted some boats quite high, while leaving many behind. That's when fear set in. People grew afraid. If you look at Europe, there were no far-right parties before 2008. From 2008 on, these parties began to emerge. Because people feared the future, climate change, finance, all factors beyond their control. Then comes the Savior who says, "I understand you. You are not being heard. You are marginalized. I'll give you the space you deserve," giving rise to the current drift.
es una deriva y tiene un único problema. Tienen estas
This
fuerzas
new
que
drift
han
has one
nacido
big problem.
y que están dejando de lado los viejos partidos.
These emergent forces have sidelined the old parties, which did not manage to respond to real issues, thus opening space for people who claim, I will solve these problems, immigration, crime, daily life. I'll take care of everything. But can they really solve it? The only way is if you have a top-level economic team that implements economic policy with a social component. Otherwise, if you try to lower inflation by eliminating wages, people have no money to buy anything. Yes, inflation goes down because no one is purchasing, but then what happens? People can't consume, and that leads to a severe social crisis. I think this situation is short-lived, perhaps lasting at most 2 electoral cycles, until 2032. Then the question arises. Either traditional parties on both the right and the left regain their ability to connect with voters and become inclusive. No longer self-referential bureaucracies with genuine citizen participation, or people will say, we tried the old parties and they didn't work. We tried the new ones and they didn't work either. So we need a strong man. And we drift toward a Cadillo figure, someone who imposes order and justice. We also don't know if that will work in the long term, so we face a very uncertain path. Humanity can find an equilibrium, but it must be global, not local. Otherwise, we will end up with a society in permanent crisis. Over all of this looms a major question mark: climate change. It is moving forward, or maybe not. We don't know. Then there is the crisis in Europe, which I consider straightforward. The moment Europe ceased to be recognized as its own entity, it effectively became NATO. People look at Europe and see NATO, meaning it has lost its identity to that military alliance and its hegemonies. Europe now has 27 countries, 10 of which have anti-EU governments, leaving the European Commission very fragile. Everything is extremely fragile right now. I'm about to give a conference in Buenos Aires on the decline of the West. What worries me is simply that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, there is a decline of the West as an imperial power, which created an unjust form of multilateralism where countries of the global South are not represented, a system favoring the North. That system can be discarded. But discarding our core values, democracy, dialogue, participation, peace, social justice, would be disastrous. Losing those means losing precisely what has sustained international unity so far. They are the building blocks we need if we want a new kind of international community. I don't see alternatives to these values as they emerge from a centuries-long modernization process, from feudalism to the present. Then there is the problem of the Catholic Church, which, in my view, has failed to adapt to the modern context. Under John Paul II, it got stuck with NATO's agenda. because John Paul II, as a Polish anti-communist, didn't understand the necessity of allowing churches in Latin America, Africa, and Asia to chart their own course. As a result, evangelical denominations have expanded in a massive way. Today, according to statistics, some 30% of Chileans are evangelical, and in the United States, there are 80 million evangelicals. In Guatemala, they elected Bukele, meaning they have major influence there. In Brazil, it seems they could play a decisive role in the next election. The Catholic Church has not been able to adapt. It remains anchored in a Western vision rather than a universal one. Pope Francis is attempting to bring a more universal outlook, but it's extremely challenging because the church is highly complex. Today, the American church has allied with the African church, both opposing the more open German church, which is bringing women into ministry. The German church decided to hold a synod of all its bishops, something that requires Vatican authorization, and the Vatican did not grant permission. They went ahead anyway, saying, "We don't want to remain in the same structure as the American and African churches." The African church persecutes homosexuals, something inconceivable in Germany. So a series of conflicts have arisen, and a schism is forming, which is very serious. The church is deeply in crisis. I believe the next pope will be key, where he comes from, what he does. Historically in the Vatican, after a progressive pope, a conservative one tends to follow. If that happens, the church will keep losing ground. We've run out of time, but I want to ask, in 1970, you made a documentary that was hidden for 30 years because it was censored by RAI, where you worked. It's now available. Will it be shown in Chile at some point? It's a documentary on the assassination of Che Guevara. Yes, it's free now. What happened is, when I made that film, I was then director of Latin American News Service at RAI. And shortly before I had won a National Journalism Prize for a 5-hour TV program on Latin America. The first time a TV journalist, not a print journalist, received that award. So I had a certain level of prestige and autonomy for about a year and a half. I went to La Paz, Guatemala, then Mexico. From Mexico, I went on to Cuba. And the second part covered Che's death. We had to find the peasant who shot him, everyone involved in Che's story. The third part looked into why Che failed, examining the peaceful coexistence agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union's order to halt guerrilla warfare in Latin America, and the Bolivian Communist Party's decision to abandon the guerrillas. There's even an interview with the party secretary on this topic, which appears in the documentary. He never spoke of it again. Altogether, there were 89 interviews where the journalist never appears on camera, because for me on television, the journalist should function as a sort of diaphragm between reality and the viewer. I don't appear in the film. I just ask the common sense questions that any viewer would ask, hoping they'd identify with them. Well, once the film was finished, the RAI director at that time, De Luca, watched it all. It was 4 hours and something, and he didn't utter a word. We were there, feeling the atmosphere freeze more and more. And finally he said, "Roberto, you've done something extraordinary, but who benefits from this film? It doesn't benefit the Russians, Cubans, or Americans. So who?" The last thing on my mind was whom it might benefit. He said, "No, really, you've done exceptional work. Take a month's paid vacation from RAI, wherever you like." So I went to Japan. While I was there, they re-edited the footage, trimming the 3.5 hours down to just over 2. It became an entirely different film from mine. When I told the press I hadn't seen it, but that it wasn't my version and I wanted the public to know, they fired me. The silver lining was that it caused a stir at the top levels of RAI. Then with subsequent leadership changes, the original film was finally made available. By that point, I was free and had already moved on with my life. Perhaps we Chileans may have the chance to see the original film, the real one, at some point. I'm happy to make it available. Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us. Roberto Savio's book, Para Comprender y Cambiar el Mundo de Hoy, which, as I understand, is already on shelves in Chile, has been launched in our country so that global citizens in Chile can understand our reality in the global one. Thank you for being with us. It's been a great pleasure, an extremely interesting interview. Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you to all of you for following us.